talk about composite entity design pattern. This pattern is used to model, represent, and manage a set of interrelated persistent objects rather than representing them as individual fine-grained entity beans. And also a composite entity bean represents a graph of objects. It has composite entity component, coarse-grained component, and dependent objects. Composite entity is a coarse-grained entity bean which may be the coarse-grained object or may contain a reference to the coarse-grained object. A coarse-grained object is an object with its own life cycle manages its own relationships to other objects. It can be an object contained in the composite entity, or composite entity itself can be coarse-grained object which holds dependent objects. Dependent object is an object which can contain other dependent objects. There may be a tree of objects within the composite entity. That depends on the coarse-grained object and has the life cycle managed by the coarse-grained object. Let's take an example here where we have composite entity test that will have main method, and we have client that will have a reference to composite entity, and it'll have the methods that are needed to access. And similarly, composite entity will have a reference to the coarse-grained and the methods that are implemented. And coarse-grained object will have reference to both dependent objects, such as dependent object 1, dependent object 2, that will have the actual implementation. This could be n number of dependent objects that could be implemented in coarse-grained object. Let's build these examples and see how it works. Let me open my Visual Studio Code and create our first dependent object. Let's name it as dependent obj1.java. That will have private string data, and let's create a getters and setter method. Let's generate them, create getter and setter. Now let's create one more object, dependent obj2.java. that will have, I'll just copy paste the object 1 and rename it to object 2. That will have similar methods, getters and setters. Now let's create our coarse-grained object. That would be new file, coarse-grained object.java. That will have first dependent object obj1 equals new dependent object. Similarly, we will have dependent object 2, obj2 equals new dependent object 2. And let's create our public void set data method, which will take data 1 and string data 2. Then we will use obj1 dot set data 1. Similarly, we will have obj2 dot set data 2. And now we will create our get data method. That would be public string array and get data. This will have both. We will return a string of both values. We will say return new string array. Within that, we will have obj1 dot get data, comma obj2 dot get data. So here, if you see, we are returning an array of strings from each of the object1 dot get data and object2 dot get data. Now let us create our composite entity. New file, composite entity.java. This will have private and coarse-grained object. We will call this as coarse-grained object. equals new coarse-grained object, and we would use public void set data and string data1, string data2. Here we will use coarse-grained object dot set data, and we are passing data1 and data2. Similarly, we will have public, return type would be string array, and we would call get data and coarse-grained object dot get data. We will return this method results written. That will have string array. Now we have created our composite entity. Let's create our client.java file, which will have composite entity. Private composite entity equals new composite entity, and within this let's create a display method. Display data. This is a method, and now we will have a loop for int I equals 0, I is less than composite entity dot get data dot length and I plus plus. So we are just iterating through the composite entity get data that will return a string array. We are iterating through that, and now let's print system.out.println. We would print the data as composite entity dot get data, and we have to pass the index because we want to print each of the data that is there in the string array. Now let's create public void set data that will have string data1, string data2. Here we would call composite entity dot set data, and we would pass data1 and data2. Now we have created all the classes that are needed. The final class would be main method class, that would be composite entity test.java. So here we would create a main method. Within that main method we would say client equals new client. So we are creating a client object that has composite entity object, and then we would use client dot set data, and we would pass John and David. Let's print this first, client dot display data, and again let's use the same object to set more data to it. We will pass Amanda and Alex. Let's print client dot display data. So here we are setting the data first and displaying the data, and again we are setting the data one more time and then displaying the data. Now let's compile all these files. Javac dot java, then we would say Java composite entity test. So if you see here, when we passed John and David as to the set data and we used client.display data, that will be using the composite entity to print the data from both, and it would be printing Amanda del X for the next display data. So this is a very basic example where we have created a composite entity that would use coarse-grained object, and coarse-grained object will have both the dependent objects. Instead of creating individual objects, we would be creating a coarse-grained object, and that coarse-grained object would be used in composite data to set and retrieve the data and process the data. So this is a very basic example, but this could be used for more complex scenarios for different cases. Hope this was helpful. Thank you for watching.